The Galactic Republic and its successor, the Galactic Empire, made use of many kinds of armored walkers over the course of the Clone Wars and the Galactic Civil War. The most memorable were among the largest of the bunch, those being the AT-TE and AT-AT, both formidable war machines. But smaller walkers, such as the Republic-era AT-RT and Imperial-era AT-ST, were just as, if not more important to the militaries of these factions, and nearly all of those smaller war machines trace their lineage back to the AT-XT. This versatile walker is somewhat obscure, but it was one of the best vehicle designs ever employed by the Republic, and in this video, we'll be examining it in detail. The all-terrain experimental transport, like all of the all-terrain walkers, was produced by Kuat Drive Yards. Specifically, the AT-XT was produced by the KDY subsidiary Rothana Heavy Engineering, which also designed the AT-TE. Rothana Heavy Engineering was based on an ice planet called, you guessed it, Rothana, and KDY assigned it projects that required strict secrecy, as the existence of Rothana was itself a secret and the planet's facilities were reliably insulated from spies and saboteurs. Such was the case for RHE's largest contract, Project Icefang, which saw the subsidiary develop the AT-TE and a whole arsenal of other war machines for use by the Grand Army of the Republic. The start of the Clone Wars and the reveal of the Grand Army's new arsenal made Rothana Heavy Engineering a galactically recognized corporation, though they were somehow still able to keep the location of Rothana a secret until after the war. However, since the existence of the GAR was no longer a secret, KDY stopped delegating contracts from the Republic out to the Rothana after the Battle of Geonosis. Later vehicles, such as the AT-RT and the first of the iconic Star Destroyers, were designed by KDY proper. There were, however, some contracts that were given to Rothana for the purposes of secrecy, and the AT-XT was one of them. It's unclear why exactly this was. It's possible that RHE started work on the AT-XT before the war began and just kept up with the project, or perhaps it was the AT-XT's status as an experimental vehicle that saw its designers assigned to the secretive ice planet. Either way, the AT-XT was meant to fill a hole in the GAR's arsenal. At the start of the Clone Wars, the Grand Army's vehicle arsenal was pretty starkly divided between light vehicles, such as speeder bikes and TX-130 fighter tanks, and heavy vehicles, such as the AT-TE and SPHAT. It lacked any intermediate-sized war machines, however, which posed a problem to Republic strategists. Speeder bikes and fighter tanks were fast and maneuverable, but they were relatively fragile and were lacking in firepower, while the AT-TE was tough as hell, but slow and easily outmaneuvered by faster Separatist tanks. The AT-XT was an attempt to bridge the gap, giving the Republic a walker that was maneuverable, but still tough, and, as far as attempts go, we'd say this one was pretty successful. Roughly 6 or 7 meters in height, the AT-XT was a moderately armored single-pilot bipedal walker, and it was revolutionary for its time. Whereas Rothana's previous walker design required 6 legs to stabilize itself and was slow to maneuver, the AT-XT was not only able to operate on just 2 legs, but it could do so across a wide variety of uneven terrain types, and at considerable speed too. It had a top speed of 75 km per hour, and it could maneuver incredibly well. Its main cabin could also rotate to allow its weapons to target flanking infantry or light vehicles without having to move its legs, further increasing the walker's flexibility in combat. Unlike the AT-TE, which required a crew of 7, only one operator was required to run an AT-XT. They sat in a forward-facing cockpit, much like the pilot of an AT-TE. The AT-XT's cabin was likely quite small, but it had enough storage space to allow the walker to carry 2 days of consumables and up to 12 kilograms of cargo. The AT-XT was pretty well armored, but its best defensive asset was its onboard plasma shield generator. This shield wasn't present on all AT-XTs and could have been a modification specifically for command walkers, but AT-XTs that had these shields could shrug off a fair amount of enemy fire without as much as a scratch. As far as offensive options were concerned, the AT-XT's main weapon was a double laser cannon mounted on the walker's chin. This weapon was powerful, able to destroy light vehicles in just a few shots, but it was accurate and fast-firing enough to also be effective against enemy infantry. The ATXT also featured a pair of proton grenade launchers located aft of the cockpit, which together had a capacity of 18 proton grenades. These launchers functioned as long-range mortars, and the grenades they fired were extremely powerful, with a volley of them able to cripple even well-armored tanks. These grenade launchers allowed the ATXT to punch far above its weight class, and when combined with the relentless firepower of the main laser cannons, they made the ATXT a force to be reckoned with, able to shed a whole column of incoming infantry and light vehicles in a matter of minutes. But as its name suggested, the ATXT was still an experimental vehicle, and its design was constantly being tweaked by Rathana heavy engineering all throughout the Clone Wars. Many different variants of the Walker saw service over the course of the conflict, but they were relatively uncommon as the Walkers were never approved for full production. Rather, the model was a sort of testbed with lessons learned from its development going on to influence the production of other intermediate-sized Walkers. For example, the ATRT, which was first deployed a few months into the Clone Wars, was based on a scaled-down version of the ATX's design. At the end of the Clone Wars, the ATXT's long design process finally culminated in a finished product, the ATST, which was heavily based on the older experimental Walker with some tweaks and improvements. Despite its capabilities, the ATXT had a rather short battlefield history, and it was, in our opinion, gravely underutilized by the Republic. Its most significant showing was during the Dark Reaper crisis a month into the war, a point in the conflict when the Republic was still fleshing out its arsenal. During this campaign, in which faster, more maneuverable vehicles were essential for Republic forces, the ATXT did a whole lot of heavy lifting in some of the campaign's most vital battles. Its first known battlefield appearance was during the Battle of Renvar, which you may know from the original Star Wars Battlefront, during which ATXTs protected Republic supply convoys and columns of heavier vehicles. The Walker's effectiveness allowed Republic forces to quickly capture their main objective in the battle, the tomb of Ulic Qel-Droma. Later in the campaign, ATXTs participated in the Battle of Thule, the Dark Reaper Crisis's final battle. Fighting alongside ATTEs and TX-130 fighter tanks, ATXTs participated in clashes both on Thule's moon Civi and at the gates of Kesiak, the planet's capital city. The Battle of Thule saw the destruction of the Dark Reaper, an ancient Sith superweapon that Count Dooku had reactivated, preventing the deaths of millions. It was ultimately a fighter tank piloted by Anakin Skywalker that took the Reaper down, but columns of ATXTs played a major role in giving him the opportunity in the first place. The only other known use of the ATXT was in the Battle of Jabim, in which it served with General Kenobi's 3rd Systems Army. The ATXT was part of a huge arsenal of armored walkers that the Republic mustered for service on Jabim, where constant electrical storms made repulsor lift tanks unreliable. The ATXT wasn't the only experimental walker involved in this battle either. Alongside ATTEs, Republic forces also fielded the first AT-ATs on Jabim, which loyalist tacticians hoped would be their trump card against the dedicated but poorly armed Jabimi separatists. However, all the Republic's walkers on Jabim suffered frequent mechanical problems due to the planet's muddy surface and constant rains, as well as by the separatists' use of landmines during the battle. The ATXT could do nothing to prevent the Republic's catastrophic defeat on Jabim, and after the battle, it seems to have been pulled from service. By the end of the Clone Wars, the Walker's successor, the ATST, had entered service, and the now outdated ATXT was fully phased out. The Galactic Republic went through a slew of starfighter models over the course of the Clone Wars, desperately seeking a way to overcome the overwhelming numbers of droid fighters deployed by the CIS. In our humble opinion, the coolest of these fighter models was the one we'll be discussing today, the ARC-170. The ARC 170 was unique among the starfighters of the Clone Wars for many reasons. It was a large craft employed at a time when both sides preferred smaller craft, it required 3 pilots to operate, and unlike many contemporary starfighters, it was hyperspace capable. In this video, we'll be discussing all of these traits and more. Officially known as the Aggressive Reconnaissance 170 starfighter, the ARC 170 was an Incom Sub-Pro product, the last known starfighter designed by the joint company before Incom and Sub-Pro split into separate corporations. It was based on an older Incom/Sub-Pro joint design, the famed Z-95 Headhunter, a popular interceptor that was modified for use by the Republic Starfighter Corps during the Clone Wars. The ARC 170 was meant to be a heavier, military-exclusive variant of the older starfighter while retaining its predecessor's broad utility and well-rounded design. It isn't clear when exactly the ARC 170 was premiered. Incom and Sub-Pro broke up shortly before the start of the Clone Wars in early 22 BBY, but many sources indicate that the ARC 170 didn't see the light of day until about a year later. There are sources that state the design was completed and sold to the Republic shortly before the outbreak of the Clone Wars, but if this was the case, it still took nearly a year for the fighter to make it to the front lines, as its first known deployment was at the Battle of Malastare in early 21 BBY. It's possible that Incom and Sub-Pro had some kind of working agreement or shared contract during the Clone Wars, especially since notable rivals Rendili Star Drive and Kuat Drive Yards had such a contract to design the first Star Destroyers around this time, but that's just speculation on our part. Regardless, the ARC 170 eventually entered into Republic service, and it was a staple of the Republic Starfighter Corps for most of the Clone Wars. At 14.5 meters long and 22.6 meters wide, it was pretty large for a starfighter, and it presented a sizable target profile for the enemy, especially its almost oversized outboard engines. However, the ARC 170 was nonetheless extremely reliable, not least because it was durable. The whole craft was heavily armored and equipped with deflector shields, the strength of which was bolstered by a pair of S-foil flaps built into each wing, which extended outwards when in combat to radiate heat, which allowed the shields to absorb more incoming fire. Despite its size and bulk, the ARC 170 was a fast ship, capable of accelerating at up to 2,600 G in space and achieving up to 44,000 km per hour in atmosphere. In part, this was a gift from the starfighter's massive engines, but the starfighter's S-foils were what enabled it to reach hypersonic atmospheric speeds as they radiated the heat accumulated from air resistance. The ARC 170 was also equipped with a Class 1.5 hyperdrive, a rarity among starfighters during the Clone Wars, which allowed it to carry out missions independently from a larger carrier. That last capability was where the ARC 170 got its name. It was impressive enough as a snub fighter, but its selling point was its capacity for independent force recon. Apart from its hyperdrive, the ARC 170 carried plenty of equipment for these sorts of missions. It had a cargo capacity of 110 kilograms and carried provisions for up to 5 days, and its communication systems were top of the line. The craft's nose was packed full of scanners and other important recon systems, including a gamma-ray imaging spectrophotometer, activity scanners, energy receptors, long-range transceivers, and a headlight. The ARC 170 also came with sensor jammers that allowed it to evade detection when scouting out enemy positions, to stealthily destroy small craft without the enemy noticing, and to provide a modicum of cover in the event of a hasty retreat. The ARC 170 required a crew of 3 plus one R2 or R4 series astromech droid. The astromech was mounted in a slot between the co-pilot and rear gunner's cockpits and was responsible for spot repairs and navigational assistance, as well as acting as the starfighter's navicomputer during hyperspace travel. The rest of the crew was typically composed of clone pilots who were each seated in their own cockpit. The starfighter's pilot was seated in the forward cockpit, while a co-pilot's cockpit was just behind and slightly above the pilot's. Typically, the pilot flew the craft while the co-pilot manned the forward weapon systems, signal jammers, and communication systems, but both pilots were seemingly able to assume full control of the craft in a pinch. The third crew member, the tail gunner, sat in a rear-facing cockpit between the astromech slot and the tail guns. Naturally, the ARC 170 was heavily armed. Its main weapons were a pair of wingtip-mounted medium laser cannons, which were incredibly powerful for starfighter-based guns and were capable of extremely precise aim. 2 laser cannons were mounted on the craft's tail, meant for defense against enemy craft attacking from the rear. The ARC 170 also featured hardpoints for concussion missiles and a proton torpedo launcher, the latter of which had a capacity of 6 torpedoes. This allowed the ARC 170 to act as a light bomber, joining Y-wings on attack runs against separatist warships. It was so effective in this role that the Republic designed 2 dedicated bombers based on the ARC 170's schematics: the NTB-630 naval bomber and the PTB-635 planetary bomber. ARC 170s were usually carried into battle aboard Venator-class star destroyers and deployed as part of the first wave of a starfighter wing. Due to the high crew requirements of the craft, the average Venator only carried 36 ARC 170s as opposed to up to 192 V-wings. Many Republic star destroyers seem to have carried many more of these formidable heavy starfighters, however, especially during the later stages of the Clone Wars. As we mentioned earlier, the ARC 170 was probably first deployed sometime in 21 BBY, and its first known engagement was the Battle of Malastare. Other notable mid-war battles in which these craft participated included the Defense of Camino, the Battle of Selast, the Battle of Lola Seyu, the Battle of Umbara, the Battle of Sarish, and the Battle of Ringo Vinda. Their use seems to have varied throughout the war. Through most of the conflict, they supplemented squadrons of lighter starfighters, such as the V-19 Torrent and Z-95 Headhunter, or accompanied dedicated Y-wing bombers on their attack runs. They were seemingly underutilized throughout 21 BBY, only really coming to their own with the advent of the Outer Rim sieges. During the final months of the Clone Wars, the ARC 170 began to be deployed in much greater numbers. Alongside the V-wing, it became one of the Republic's leading starfighter models, and although the lighter V-wing was still deployed in larger numbers, the ARC 170 became the poster boy of the Republic Starfighter Corps, playing a deciding role in many battles. In battles like Tyth and Cato Nemoidia, ARC 170s were the most prominent starfighters deployed by Republic forces, and though they were expensive to maintain and required 3 times as many pilots as most craft, they were undeniably effective. The Open Circle Armada, a major Republic Navy fleet group associated with Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker's Third Systems Army, was known to make extensive use of the ARC 170, which played a role in popularizing the craft during the Outer Rim sieges. When Open Circle joined the Battle of Coruscant in 19 BBY, it brought its ARC 170s with it, and these nimble craft fought fiercely in the climax of the Clone Wars. Many were destroyed by the agile droid Tri-Fighters, the Confederacy's most feared interceptor, but the ARC 170's tail guns allowed them to fare better against the deadly separatist craft than the Republic's other fighters. During the early years of the Galactic Empire, the ARC 170 was one of the main Imperial fightercraft models, though Imperial tacticians much preferred to deploy the V-wing over the more rugged ARC 170. However, the ARC 170 was pretty quickly phased out of Imperial service due to its incompatibility with the Tarkin Doctrine, which favored lighter craft like the V-wing and the new TIE fighters. The few Imperial ARC 170s that remained in service were used as training craft or for patrols out in regions the Empire considered unimportant. An ignoble fate for such an effective craft. However, the ARC 170 did see some limited post-war use in the hands of some rebel factions, including the Alliance to Restore the Republic. The Incom Corporation also took heavy inspiration from its design in creating what would become the Alliance's most iconic starfighter, the T-65 X-Wing. The Rebels' X-Wings would go on to play a major role in defeating the Empire, thus avenging their undervalued predecessors. The BARC Speeder is one of the most recognizable Republic vehicles, acting as the main speeder bike of the Grand Army of the Republic for much of the Clone Wars. These versatile war machines appear in numerous configurations over the course of Star Wars: The Clone Wars and other stories from the era, each of them effective in their own way. In this video, we're going to be taking a closer look at the BARC Speeder and its many variants, analysing what made them so much better than the other speeder models of the time. The BARC Speeder was a product of Aerotech Repulsor Company, which also manufactured another model of military speeder bike that was wildly popular in the era, the 74Z, which you probably remember as the speeder bike model seen in Return of the Jedi. Aerotech pledged its loyalty to the Republic during the Clone Wars, and during the early months of the war, its 74Zs were the primary speeder bike used by the Grand Army of the Republic. But as the Clone Wars went on, Aerotech began experimenting with other speeder bike designs, ultimately resulting in the BARC Speeder. BARC stands for Biker Advanced Recon Commando, and as the name might suggest, the BARC Speeder was originally designed for the exclusive use of the Republic's Advanced Recon Commandos. After their initial deployment in the First Battle of Camino, the first 100 of these ARC troopers requisitioned all sorts of special gear from the Republic suppliers for use on the front lines. And the BARC Speeder was only one of many pieces of equipment that were initially reserved for their use. But like many other pieces of ARC trooper gear, the BARC Speeder didn't stay exclusive. The Speeder performed so well in battle that the Republic ended up making it available to the whole Grand Army. By the end of 22 BBY, it had completely replaced the 74Z as the primary speeder bike of the Clone Army, though the 74Z did continue to see some limited use. Since the control setup for the BARC Speeder was pretty similar to that of the 74Z, it was an easy switch for the army to make. Over the course of the Clone Wars, clones and Jedi of all classes made use of these versatile war machines. Like with the AT-RT, there were clones who were specifically trained to pilot these speeders, the appropriately named BARC troopers, but most of the time, BARC speeders were just flown by ordinary clones. At roughly 4.5 meters long, the BARC Speeder was only slightly larger than the 74Z, but it nonetheless featured a dramatic increase in firepower, armoring, and speed. As with most speeder bikes, the BARC Speeder was a repulsor lift craft, and it was propelled forward by a set of powerful turbine engines, one mounted on the front of the bike, and two more, meant for steering, mounted to either side of the driver. They propelled the speeder forward at up to 520 km per hour, while the repulsor lifts allowed them to fly pretty high above a planet's surface, to the point where BARC speeders were sometimes used to escort LAAT gunships. The BARC speeder's driver sat just in front of the main reactor, operating the bike via a pair of pedals and a set of control handlebars. The number of handlebars differed based on the model. Most of those seen only have 2, like the 74Z, while some BARC variants had 4 handlebars for reasons unknown. There was a small computer display at the base of the handlebars which likely displayed diagnostic data, and somewhere on the bike was a compartment with 5 kilograms of storage space. The BARC Speeder was well armoured, much more so than the comparatively skeletal 74Z. The turbine engines each featured adjustable armoured flaps to further shield them from enemy fire, which could be adjusted to provide more protection to the driver. But what most dramatically differentiated the BARC Speeder from the 74Z was its armament. While its older cousin only featured a single blaster cannon, the BARC Speeder featured 4, and on top of that, they all appeared to be more powerful than the 74Zs. 2 of these blaster cannons were mounted at the front of the bike on either side of the main turbine engine, somewhat hidden by the forward armor flaps, while 2 others were mounted atop each of the rear maneuvering engines. These guns were primarily intended for anti-personnel use, but they were also effective against other speeder bikes and light vehicles. On top of that, the BARC Speeder had hardpoints on its right side that could be used to add attachments to the bike. One such attachment was a portable stretcher, which could be used to rapidly carry a wounded trooper out of the fray. In this configuration, the forward flaps of the BARC Speeder were angled outward to shield the passenger's head from the wind. Alternatively, BARC Speeders could mount an armed sidecar using these hardpoints. This sidecar could seat a single passenger, and it probably had its own built-in repulsor lifts to support the added weight, as it was attached to the main bike only by a pair of thin, adjustable arms. These sidecars featured small repeating blaster turrets for the passenger to man, thus making them worthwhile additions for BARC Speeders destined for the front lines. All of these BARC Speeder variants were intended strictly for military use, though BARC Speeders could be bought on the open market for just over 8,000 credits by those who had the connections. But there was one civilian variant that also saw extensive use, the Rapid Response Police Speeder. This was basically just a BARC Speeder with police lights and a different coat of paint, which is interesting because we have our doubts that a police vehicle really needs military-grade blaster cannons on it, never mind 4 of them. These police BARCs were most prominently seen on Coruscant, but presumably they saw use on other Republic worlds as well. Starting toward the end of 22 BBY, BARC Speeders were a common sight on the battlefields of the Clone Wars, as well as on Coruscant and other Loyalist worlds. They saw extensive use behind friendly lines, acting as escorts for in-atmosphere gunships serving Republic military bases, and as police vehicles on certain Republic member worlds. On the battlefield, they were frequently used for recon and patrol duties, though they also acted as cavalry on the front lines. Many Jedi seemed particularly fond of BARC Speeders, but more often than not, these craft were flown into battle by clone troopers. BARC Speeders saw action in battles on Coruscant, Seleucami, Kashyyyk, Christosis, Auto Plutonia, Geonosis, and Kadavo, to name just a few. They proved their combat effectiveness in many of these battles. Notably, in the Siege of Felucia, BARC Speeders actually went up against Vulture droids in low atmosphere and came out on top, managing to best the starfighters with their blaster cannons. On Coruscant and Kashyyyk, they played essential roles in driving back droid army forces, showing particular usefulness against droid infantry. And on Seleucami, in the last days of the war, 2 BARC Speeders proved effective against a different sort of target. Stas Ali, who was shot down by Commander Neo and a fellow BARC trooper after the issuance of Order 66. For all their effectiveness though, BARC Speeders didn't have all that long of an operational history. After the end of the Clone Wars, the Republic became the Empire, and at first, the BARC Speeder continued to see use in the hands of Imperial scouts. But just a few years after the end of the war, the BARC Speeder was phased out of active duty, replaced by the older 74Z, which would become the Empire's standard issue speeder bike. It's not clear why this switch was made. The BARC Speeder was better across the board. It was only a few hundred credits more expensive per unit than the 74Z, and the 2 bikes were made by the same company. Whatever the reason though, the BARC Speeder was retired before its time, and by the time of the Galactic Civil War, they were mostly used by spacers and rebels who had acquired them secondhand. By the end of the Clone Wars, the Grand Army of the Republic's vehicle arsenal had swollen to include dozens of new war machines, from countless kinds of all-terrain walkers to repulsor lift tanks. Some of these new crafts, like the Juggernaut tank and the AT-AT, became infamous and widely recognizable, while others saw little action and were more or less forgotten, both in universe and among fans. One of the latter craft is the Infantry Support Platform, or ISP for short, better known as the Swamp Speeder. These craft appeared very briefly in Revenge of the Sith, and haven't been seen much since. In this video, we'll be shedding some light on this underrated little speeder. Most of you are surely familiar with the BARC Speeder, an Aerotech Repulsor Company product that became the GAR's primary speeder model during the Clone Wars. The ISP is actually a related design, though it might not look like it. It started life as an Aerotech concept for a heavier version of the BARC that could perform well in muddy, waterlogged environments where BARC speeders and most other speeder bikes were prone to getting their intakes clogged. Aerotech's design was ultimately made reality by another company, Ulshos Manufacturing, which began churning out infantry support platforms near the end of the Clone Wars. The reason why another company was brought in to finish the ISP is uncertain, but whatever the reason, the Republic began adding these craft to its arsenals by the start of 19 BBY, the last year of the war. Unlike the BARC Speeder, which was a proper speeder bike, the ISP was more accurately classified as a land speeder. It couldn't fly all that far above the ground, and it was much slower than its smaller cousin. It also had a different mission profile. The ISP was designed to be able to handle a wider variety of terrain, hence its nickname, the Swamp Speeder, and to be able to hold its own against much tougher craft. While the BARC Speeder was effective against infantry, other speeder bikes, and in some cases lightly armoured starfighters, the ISP could additionally take on light tanks and shielded gunships with surprising effectiveness. Its general purpose, which we're sure you'll never guess from the name, was to provide fire support for clone infantry, and it was designed more or less perfectly for this job. The base of the ISP was a 5 meter wide hemispherical repulsor lift platform which floated roughly a meter off the ground. Though this platform might look unnecessarily large, its size served a vital purpose. It spread out the craft's weight over a larger area, which was essential for maintaining balance on unstable terrain, even for repulsor lift vehicles. The size of this platform allowed it to host a wide variety of sensors, and it also allowed the ISP to carry passengers, though it doesn't seem to us like riding on one of these things was a safe idea. The ISP was propelled by a large, rear-mounted turbofan engine. It could accelerate the craft at speeds up to 100 km per hour, and it was highly adjustable to allow for increased maneuverability. The turbofan could even fire backwards to rapidly decelerate the craft, preventing collisions with trees and other sudden obstacles. Though turbofans were considered antiquated by the time of the Clone Wars, they made less noise than ion engines, which was super useful for vehicles designed to operate in swamps and jungles, as large predators on many planets were known to mistake the sound of ion engines for their kind's mating calls. Each ISP was piloted by 2 clone troopers sat on either side of the main engine. The roles of the pilots are unclear, but it's possible that one would pilot the craft while the other manned its weapons. Unlike on most speeder bikes, which left their drivers exposed, the ISP's pilots enjoyed a modicum of protection, as the ISP featured a pair of large armoured mud shields on its front, which shielded the pilots from mud and blaster fire alike. The pilots were still quite exposed from pretty much every other angle, however, so they didn't have it too much better than other bike drivers. The ISP itself was still pretty heavily armoured though, and it was presumably insulated against mud and other contaminants. The ISP's weapons were mounted on their own small platform at the front of the craft. These weapons were apparently modular, at least according to canon sources, though most of the time, ISPs just had twin dual-barreled blaster cannons. These guns were rapid firing but precise, and they were primarily meant for use against enemy infantry, which they could mow down with impressive speed. They were also apparently powerful enough to be able to shoot down starfighters, gunships, and tanks, even shielded ones. This is even more impressive given how low the guns are mounted, and since they don't appear to have all that high of a firing arc. These guns also had 2 firing modes, a linked firing mode, which allowed one pilot to operate both turrets at once, and an independent firing mode, which allowed each pilot to operate one of the turrets. This was the case with the variant ISPs as well. According to canon, there were 2 variants of the ISP with different weapons configurations. One swapped the blaster cannons out for a pair of powerful beam cannons, similar to the OG-9 homing spider droid's main weapon, while another variant instead featured a pair of multi-missile pods which could unleash sprays of tracking missiles upon enemy vehicles. Both of these variants were apparently rarely seen, however, and most ISPs just had the standard blaster cannon loadout. All of these variants were extremely effective against enemy infantry, and even the lightest variant could take out Corporate Alliance tank droids and HMP gunships. This really begs the question of why the ISP was so rarely seen. Evidently, they were extraordinarily effective for their size. As we mentioned earlier, the infantry support platform only debuted toward the end of the Clone Wars, sometime around the start of 19 BBY. It saw the most use in swampy, waterlogged environments where most Republic vehicles were inoperable, providing Republic infantry with vital armored support. If the value of this isn't immediately apparent to you, consider the Battle of Umbara, which happened before the ISP's debut. On Umbara, terrain complications meant that only AT-RTs were available for infantry support, and for the most part, that left Republic infantry at the mercy of more specialized Umbaran vehicles. The ISP could have been a game changer on Umbara, especially with its anti-vehicular capabilities. The most notable battlefield appearances of the ISP were on Felucia and Kashyyyk, both during the Outer Rim sieges. On Felucia, ISPs helped scan Felucia's dense jungles for incoming hostiles, while on Kashyyyk, ISPs proved effective at just about everything the Separatists threw at Kachiro Beach, pulling its weight even while being overshadowed by larger Republic and Wookiee vehicles. ISPs were also used in the Battle of Megiddo, presumably due to the unstable nature of Megiddo's giant bridges. It's also possible that ISPs participated in the Battle of Cato Nemoidia, though this isn't known for sure. After the end of the Clone Wars, the ISP continued to see use in the hands of the Galactic Empire, and unlike many Republic vehicles, the Empire actually kept it around, making use of it even during the Galactic Civil War. Despite this, many ISPs still made it into the hands of the Empire's enemies, including the Alliance to Restore the Republic and numerous criminal factions, including the Hutts, Black Sun, and Zan Consortium. All of these factions made good use of the ISP in combat, using them in raids or to defend their strongholds. Despite its relatively long service record, however, the ISP was always used selectively, so it never became all that prominent. It was a highly effective vehicle, but it was always competing with other highly effective vehicles for its niche on the front lines. The Republic had about a dozen other light vehicles that overlapped with the ISP's capabilities, as did the Empire, while other factions that made use of these craft had very few of them, since they were still Imperial military craft and thus difficult to obtain privately. As the Republic's collection of Walker models diversified over the course of the Clone Wars, a few strange designs found their way to the front lines. Alongside more conventional all-terrain walkers like the AT-TE, AT-RT, and AT-AT, marched the open-topped AT-OT, the diminutive AT-PT, and the three-legged AT-AP. It's the latter vehicle we'll be talking about today. Some of you might be unfamiliar with the AT-AP. It only appeared in the background of Revenge of the Sith, and it's one of those Star Wars vehicles that's known mostly for the merchandise that was based on it. But the AT-AP was nonetheless a formidable and highly unusual vehicle, and in this video, we'll be analysing it in detail. Sometime into the Clone Wars, the Galactic Republic determined that it needed to diversify its assortment of heavy vehicles. For most of the war, the Republic had relied heavily on the venerable AT-TE, which, while very effective, had a number of shortcomings that its makers at Kuat Drive Yards hoped to overcome with additional support walkers. Some of the walker designs KDY brought to the table for additional heavy walkers were natural evolutions of the AT-TE's design, such as the long-legged AT-HE and AT-AT. Others filled vital niches that AT-TE type walkers couldn't, such as the AT-RT Scout Walker and the AT-XT, which was somewhere between the AT-RT and AT-TE. Then there's the AT-AP. About midway through the Clone Wars, one of KDY's designers, presumably after snorting a line of spice, had the idea to just take the front half of the AT-TE and develop it into a new walker line. The All-Terrain Attack Pod, or AT-AP, was the result. This bizarre walker was essentially just half an AT-TE with more guns and longer legs. It was technically bipedal, but it had a third leg that was deployed to anchor the walker to the ground when it wanted to shoot things, as firing the main gun without doing so risked knocking the whole walker over due to recoil. The result was more of a mobile artillery piece than a conventional walker, and even then, it was only mobile when it wasn't shooting at anything. It's not a bad design, don't get us wrong, but it was undeniably a strange piece of equipment. At 11 meters tall, the AT-AP was on the larger side for a Republic walker. Its main cabin was quite similar, at least on the outside, to AT-TE's, but it was mounted on considerably taller legs, which allowed the AT-AP to tower over the battlefield. Its two main drive legs were huge and heavily armored, while its stabilizer leg, which was typically folded up under the main cabin when not in use, was a little smaller. Without the stabilizer leg deployed, the HAV looked rather ungainly and front-heavy, but it was surprisingly good at keeping its balance and could move at up to 60 km per hour, which is a lot faster than you might expect just looking at it. The main reactor of the HAV appears to have been mounted behind the main cabin, possibly playing a role in stabilizing this giant while its stabilizer leg was folded up. The main cabin itself evoked the ATTEs and it was comparably well armored, but its internal configuration was apparently far removed from that of its predecessor. The cabin was accessed via armored flaps on either side, which swung down to form access ramps, though these ramps weren't long enough to reach the ground, so the HAV likely relied on some sort of support structure to allow the crew to board. There's also what looks to be a spotter's hatch of some sort on the front of the Walker. Unlike the cabins on the ATTE, which were designed to transport troops in battle, there was no room for passengers in an HAV's cabin, though there was storage space for 2 days of consumables and an additional 200 kilograms of cargo. 2 crewmen were stationed inside the main cabin, a single pilot and the main gunner. The third and final member of the Walker's crew, the auxiliary gunner, sat in a turret on top of the main cabin. Behind the auxiliary gunner's chair was a supply cage with repair equipment, a necessary addition since apparently the HAV often suffered mechanical issues in its articulation assemblies. When this happened, it fell to the secondary gunner to climb over and perform spot repairs. Primarily, the HAV was a mobile artillery piece, much like the enormous self-propelled heavy artillery tanks used by the Republic early in the war. Indeed, the HAV worked as a sort of mini SPHAT, and though it lacked the sheer power of the older Walker, it had a respectable array of high-powered weapons in its own right. Mounted on the chin of the main cabin was a medium laser cannon which was angled downwards and meant as a defensive weapon. Enemy infantry that got too close to an HAV would be subjected to fire from this weapon, which was powerful enough to be able to fend off most close-range attackers. The HAV's other secondary weapon was its top-mounted heavy blaster turret, which had a full 360 degrees of rotation and high enough of a firing arc to be able to defend the Walker from enemy aircraft. This weapon was manned by the auxiliary gunner, who used it to fire on approaching vehicles, allowing the main gunner to focus on shelling enemy positions. The main gun of the HAV was an enormous mass driver cannon. This bad boy fired huge Durasteel shells encased in energy sheaths with incredible accuracy, and it was so powerful that it required the aforementioned stabilizer leg just to prevent its recoil from pulverizing the Walker. This weapon was absolutely devastating, even more so than the main mass driver on the ATTE, able to absolutely obliterate entrenched enemy positions and spacecraft alike. The mass driver was meant for long-range bombardment, and with the proper targeting data, it could accurately fire on targets that were beyond visual range, earning the HAV the nickname of Sniper Tank. Unlike many other Republic walkers, the HAV wasn't viable to use on its own. Since it was stationary when firing with its main weapon and intended for extremely long range, Republic forces only deployed it alongside other heavy vehicles such as the ATTE, UT-AT, or Juggernaut tank. With support, the HAV was extremely effective. It could support its fellow heavy tanks against incoming infantry and vehicles, while its mass drivers shelled their positions from range. The HAV's effectiveness at dismantling separatist positions meant that it saw a ton of use during the Outer Rim sieges, in which it was used to dismantle the core of entrenched separatist forces, while the rest of the army dealt with the enemy's forward units. It proved to be more useful in sieges than the SPHAT for artillery pieces, since it had a smaller target profile and could contribute more to its own defense. Countless clone units made use of HAVs during the war's last few months, including the 212th Attack Battalion, the 41st Elite Corps, the 327th Star Corps, the 91st Reconnaissance Corps, and the 282nd, 121st, 96th, and 76th Regiments. The HAP saw particularly extensive use during the Battle of Kashyyyk, where it worked together with the Juggernaut tanks to destroy the Confederacy's gunships, tanks, and troop carriers, as well as its landing zones on the other side of the Wawat archipelago. Other notable engagements in which this walker participated included the Siege of Seleucami and the Battle of Fallujah. In the immediate aftermath of the Clone Wars, they also saw action in Imperial service during the subjugation of Kashyyyk, in which the very walkers that had defended Kashyyyk from the Confederacy turned and bombarded its forest cities. The HAP was eventually phased out by the Galactic Empire, though it continued to see action in Imperial service for some time. By the time of the Galactic Civil War, many of these walkers had fallen into the hands of the Empire's enemies. The Hutts and the Zaan Consortium had a few, while the Alliance to Restore the Republic had a collection of HAPs that had been stolen right off Imperial production lines. Nonetheless, these walkers saw only limited use in post-Clone Wars conflict. The ATTE Walker may have been the Grand Army of the Republic's most well-known vehicle, but the HAVw A6 Juggernaut was its most effective. These colossal rolling slabs had nigh impregnable armor, a vast carrying capacity, and enough firepower to take on a whole column of separatist tanks. At 50 meters in length, the Juggernaut was the largest ground vehicle in the Republic's arsenal, and as you might expect from such a huge craft, it had a large and lively crew. But what did each of the Juggernaut's crew members do? What was it like inside these behemoths, and how did they work? In this video, we'll be answering those questions. The Juggernaut was huge, fast, and very difficult to do serious damage to, as it featured incredibly thick armor on all sides. Designed and produced by Kuwait Drive Yards, these fearsome tanks required a crew of 20 and could carry anywhere between 50 and 300 clone troopers depending on the internal configuration, with an additional 30 tons of cargo storage. It featured a top-mounted anti-vehicular heavy laser cannon, a rapid-firing heavy laser turret mounted atop the rear end of the craft, two side-mounted anti-personnel laser cannons, two twin anti-personnel blaster cannons mounted on the chin of the larger cockpit, and a pair of retractable side-mounted rocket launchers, each capable of spewing off 21 rockets at once. If that impressive arsenal of weapons wasn't enough, the Juggernaut was also capable of just running things over. Its gargantuan wheels could not only crush enemy infantry, but also light vehicles. Roughly a third of the Juggernaut was dedicated to just making it move. The undercarriage section, which was roughly 10 meters tall on its own, was completely packed with the Juggernaut's onboard reactor, the drive shafts, steering pinions, and suspension, with the only accessible parts being small damage control ducts. This vast assemblage of machinery allowed the Juggernaut to reach speeds of up to 160 km per hour despite its size, plowing through anything in its path on 10 multi-segmented, independently suspended drive wheels. The main body of the Juggernaut sat right above the undercarriage section, divided into three parts: the two heads, located at either end of the tank, and the troop cabin, which was located between them. Each of the Juggernaut's heads contained cockpits, and since the tank could be driven from either one, there was plenty of debate, both in-universe and out-of-universe, about which cockpit was the front of the tank. For the purposes of this video, we're going to consider the larger cockpit as the front of the Juggernaut, since it's seen as the front more often, and it's also where the commanding officer's station was. In-universe, however, there was no real front to the Juggernaut. It could be driven perfectly fine in either direction, which compensated for the massive tank's low mobility in tight spaces. The Juggernaut was usually accessed via the rear troop deployment hatch, a ramp that could be lowered down from the Juggernaut's smaller head. The smaller head also contained the auxiliary cockpit, which was a lot more cramped than you might expect looking at it from the outside, since most of the head was given over to the deployment hatch. The cockpit was accessed by a pair of flip-down hatches which formed the sloping ceiling of the deployment ramp when closed. This strikes us as a bit of a safety hazard, since the aft cockpit crew would be completely trapped if those hatches ever got stuck at the same time, but safety hazards are a given for Star Wars vehicles, so at least KDY was being consistent there. From the rear head, an armored corridor led through the thin neck of the tank into the main cabin. The cabin had two decks, both of which were dominated by gunnery stations and seating for embarked troops. The lower deck consisted of a series of small troop compartments that could be sealed off from each other, while the upper deck was mostly open and had an upper walkway along the sides. A thick power trunk ran straight up through the center of the troop cabins, leading to the topside heavy turret. On the lower decks, this power trunk was concealed behind the cabin walls, while on the upper deck, it was right out in the open, surrounded by a ring of gunnery stations. The rest of the upper deck was mostly storage and seating. 3 hatches were built into the roof of the main cabin. 2 were located right next to the spotter's tower and were used to reload the rocket launchers, while the other, the upper troop deployment hatch, was located right in front of the main cannon. This hatch allowed troops from the main cabins to deploy from the top of the Juggernaut in situations where deploying from the rear was impractical, and it also provided access to the spotter's tower. Easily the worst position on the entire tank, the spotter's tower was a small armored pod that extended on a retractable mast up from the main hull, granting a bird's eye view of that battlefield. When deployed, the mast of the tower would become a ladder that an unlucky clone would climb to take his seat in the pod of death. The main cabin was connected to the front head by several blast doors which led into a labyrinth of crew posts and other stations. The head of the Juggernaut contained a fully stocked med lab, complete with a 21B surgical droid, as well as the main sensor dome, 2 gunnery stations, the main cockpit, and 2 command posts. The first command post was heavily armored and located right beneath the sensor dome, while the other command post was a simple hatch built into the main cockpit that the tank's commanding officer could use to observe the battlefield, if they were feeling particularly suicidal. At least the spotter had no real choice in being in an insanely exposed position. You either had to be dumb or a Jedi to climb up into that front hatch. Now that we've gone through the full layout of the Juggernaut's interior, let's talk about the crew. Sourcebooks say that the Juggernaut had a crew of 20, split between 12 pilots and 8 gunners. The 8 gunners number checks out, but the number of pilots does not. There were crew that were neither pilots nor gunners on the Juggernaut as well, among them the spotter, navigator, and commanding officer. We're going to assume that the 20 crew and 8 gunners figure is right, but that the remaining 12 crew members weren't all pilots, since that's probably what was originally intended anyway. There were also at least 2 droids aboard Juggernauts, the aforementioned medical droid and an astromech stationed in the troop hold. However, since Republic ground vehicles typically didn't include droids in crew figures, we're not going to count them in the total of 20. Let's start with the gunners. As we already mentioned, each Juggernaut was crewed by 8 clone gunners. Stations for 5 of them were all clustered around the main power trunk on the upper deck of the troop hold, presumably controlling the main heavy cannon, the medium anti-personnel cannons, and the rocket launchers. 2 more gunnery stations were located just behind the larger cockpit, and they were each linked to one of the chin-mounted anti-personnel cannons. The final gunner was stationed at the back of the smaller cockpit, and he controlled the rapid repeating heavy turret. In the cannon cross-section of the Juggernaut, the front cockpit appears to have had 2 pilots, and we're going to assume the same was the case for the rear cockpit, bringing us up to a total of 4 pilots. The forward cockpit also has a navigator and a communications officer, and we can presume the same is true for the rear cockpit as well. In the larger head only, a clone major was typically stationed in the armored command station, and of course, there's also the poor spotter up in the please kill me tower. That leaves 2 members of the Juggernaut crew whose roles are uncertain. If we had to guess, we'd say their job was to reload the rocket launchers, since that apparently had to be done manually. They could also have been the maintenance or quartermasters or spotter replacements. Despite the size of the Juggernaut and how spread out onboard personnel were, Juggernaut crews worked together pretty well. Pilots, gunners, and secondary crew in each cockpit formed close-knit teams, often arguing with each other about which head was the true front of the tank. The main hold gunners also worked closely together, allowing Juggernauts to quickly concentrate fire on priority targets. Even the spotter was in constant contact with the gunners and cockpit teams until he was unalived, appraising the rest of the crew when the situation on the ground changed. All told, the average Juggernaut crew was a well-oiled machine, and they and their behemoth tanks had a massive impact in the final months of the Clone Wars. During the Clone Wars, the most iconic symbols of the Republic Navy were Star Destroyers, kilometer-long wedge-shaped warships that acted as flagships, carriers, and frontline battleships. For most of the war, the Venator-class Star Destroyer was the backbone of the newly rebuilt Navy, joined midway through the war by the Victory-class and later the Imperator, Tector, and possibly Executor classes. These were the largest Republic vessels most beings were familiar with, but some even larger vessels were waiting in the wings of the Republic Navy. These titanic battleships dwarfed the Star Destroyers they led into battle, and you've likely never heard of any of them. In this video, we're going to be changing that and explain why the Republic rarely used these massive vessels. After the new Sith were vanquished in the 7th Battle of Ruusan, the Republic was reorganized under the Ruusan Reformations. The Reformations, among other things, completely restructured the Republic military. The Republic's central military was dissolved, replaced with the comparatively tiny judicial forces, and a system of planetary security forces was established, putting each sector in charge of its own defense. At first, PSF naval forces primarily used old Republic warships, but newer warships slowly became more common, especially in the fleets of the wealthy core worlds. While the core and the colonies weren't under threat during this period, many sectors built elaborate defense fleets featuring the newest and most powerful vessels credits could buy. These fleets were mostly for show, providing a way for wealthy worlds to show off their military power. Many new warships were built specifically for these peacock fleets, including some truly huge vessels. Around 200 years before the Clone Wars, one such vessel, Kuat Drive Yards' Praetor-class star battlecruiser, became the largest warship in service with a length of 2,500 meters. More massive vessels would soon follow, but built in small batches and sold exclusively to core world navies. The power of these massive warships was limited by the Ruusan Reformations, placed caps on hyperdrive speed and total armament. Because of this, these huge warships had very short jump ranges, and the larger they were, the less practical they became due to the armament restrictions. The core worlds that burned their state budgets on these huge warships didn't care about this, of course, they just wanted to show off. Due to the limitations of these warships, they sat out during the start of the Clone Wars since they needed retrofitting to become battleworthy. At enormous cost, some were equipped with better weapons and decent hyperdrives, while Kuat Drive Yards slowly began to churn out upgraded models for the Republic Navy. Even the upgraded vessels saw little action, however, since they were still owned by local forces far from the front lines. After the Battle of Rendili, however, the PSFs were nationalized, and from that point forward, these huge battleships finally began to see some action. There were 4 of these massive Republic battleships in total, all KDY products, 2 of which predated the war and 2 of which were first deployed mid-conflict. The first is the Praetor-class star battlecruiser, the successor to the aforementioned Praetor-class. These 4-kilometer-long behemoths were pre-Clone Wars vessels, and as such had somewhat disappointing firepower for their size, a flaw that retrofits could only do so much to correct. However, they proved extremely effective as flagships due to their incredible durability, which was bolstered even further by Clone Wars era retrofits such as improved armor. These upgrades turned the Praetor into a flying fortress, ideal for commanding vast armadas. The Praetor was perhaps the most common of the 4 ships we'll be discussing today. During the Outer Rim sieges, Praetor-class battlecruisers led invasion fleets in some of the most critical offenses. One, the Quaestor, was responsible for the destruction of an entire planet during this period, even if it was an accident. The Quaestor was one of the Republic's main flagships, tasked with leading offensives deep into Separatist space. During the final months of the war, it led an assault on Permant, one of the Confederacy's primary shipyards. The Quaestor suffered extensive damage during the battle, which ultimately caused the hyperdrive to malfunction and jump the ship directly into the planet. The resultant collision destroyed the Quaestor, shattered Permant's crust, and doused the entire planet in radiation, rendering it uninhabitable, a testament to the massive reactor power of the Praetor-class. Before we move on, we'd like to briefly discuss the Praetor-class's successor, the Praetor-class, developed during the early Imperial era. Though we have little concrete data about the original Praetor-class, we know a lot about the Praetor II, which could shed some light on the specs of its predecessor. The Praetor II was slightly larger and much more heavily armed, requiring a crew of over 100,000. It could carry over 100 starfighters and 14,000 troops, and was armed with 60 heavy quad-turbo lasers, 40 medium-turbo lasers, 10 long-range ion cannons, and 30 short-range ion cannons. That's a terrifying amount of stopping power, and if the Praetor-1 had even a quarter of that, it would have been formidable indeed. The next ship we have to discuss was about the same size as the Praetor, the Maelstrom-class battlecruiser. Premiered midway through the Clone Wars, the Maelstrom looked like a giant Venator with a delta-shaped hull and 2 command bridges. It could carry 15,000 troops and around 100 starfighters, much like the Praetor 2, though it required less than half the crew. The Maelstrom was armed with 20 HAVw turbo laser batteries, 10 heavy ion cannons, 20 medium turbo lasers, 10 quad concussion missile launchers, and 30 proton torpedo launchers, as well as a whole lot of tractor beam emitters. This is an interesting weapons profile, to say the least. The Maelstrom's weapons were mostly ion cannons and missiles with relatively few conventional turbo lasers. The Maelstrom nonetheless had plenty of potential, and it likely would have lived up to its name on the battlefield were it not for the Battlecruisers' enormous cost. Each Maelstrom cost 158 million credits, and because of this, very few were ever manufactured, leaving the Praetor as the Republic's primary battlecruiser. The Praetor and the Maelstrom were both huge and impressively destructive, but they were each only half the size of the Republic's biggest warships. Kuat Drive Yard's largest creations to date, the Mandator 1st and Mandator 2nd class star Dreadnaughts, were 8 kilometers long, the largest Republic vessels ever produced. There weren't many of these gargantuan craft in service, and they didn't see all that much action in the Clone Wars because of this, but they inspired one of the Empire's most infamous warships, the Executor-class star Dreadnought. The original Mandator-class star Dreadnought was unveiled 2 decades before the Clone Wars, meant to serve as the flagship of Kuat's home defense fleet. Only 7 were ever made, with 3 owned by the Kuat sector fleet, and 1 each owned by the local fleets of Ixtla, Humbarine, Anaxis, and Alsacan. The specs of the massive vessel are completely unknown, aside from that it required a colossal reactor. During the Clone Wars, only 3 of the 7 existing Mandators were retrofitted with better hyperdrives and more weapons, and the class saw very little action during the conflict. Retrofitting the Mandator class was extraordinarily expensive and, in the opinion of KDY's engineers, more trouble than it was worth. Instead, KDY designed a new and improved version of the Star Dreadnought, the Mandator 2nd class, which was deployed in 19 BBY. The Mandator 2 was so heavily armed and armored that it was practically unstoppable, and while it had a very limited production run due to its extreme cost, those Mandator 2s that saw action kicked some serious ass. It took 1,000 of the Confederacy's Recusant class light destroyers to bring down just one of these behemoths. As a final note, the Mandator and Mandator 2 originate from legends, but contrary to what you might think, they're actually a thing in canon as well. In canon, the Mandator line continued during and after the time of the Empire, culminating in the Mandator 4th class siege Dreadnought, which featured prominently at the start of The Last Jedi.